Right, welcome everyone. I'm Julie Lindsay, and this is our INF 537 alumni and current student session for our Digital Futures Colloquium. This is our, let's see, number 5, I think, guest colloquium for this particular semester. And I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Adrian Stagg, who is the Manager of Open Education at University of Southern Queensland. I don't know why I paused there because I have been with the university for over 6 years as a student myself. Look, Adrian has a lot of things to tell us about open learning and open education. So Adrian, I'm going to pass straight to you. If you would like to say more about who you are and what you do as an introduction, particularly your link with Charles Sturt might be interesting for people as well. And then take it away. Thanks so much and welcome.
Thank you very much, Julie, and thanks very much for the invitation. I feel very privileged to be here tonight, especially given the fact that, as I have included in my introduction, I am a CSU alumnus. So I studied both my bachelor and my master's at Charles Sturt, both of them in library and information management. Before I start going into any details about myself, I always like to know to whom I'm speaking and your backgrounds and the like. So I'm just wondering whether or not, if you, in the chat, would you mind putting in there whether or not you are involved with libraries, with schools, K-12, higher education, industry, those sorts of things, just so I get a bit of an idea about where you're coming from. Right.
Right, everyone's finding the chat. Good.
We're good.
Yeah, it's working.
Screen higher ed, excellent. There are a couple of K-12 folk. Right, libraries and digital technology, excellent. And I should probably provide a word of warning as well, that as we go through tonight, I'll take a few breaks as we go through, because listening to me for 45 minutes straight falls under cruel and unusual. And so what we're going to do is break it up. And I've got plenty of questions for you to ponder. And I try to treat these sorts of things as a conversation, because I like to learn as much from the people in the audience, hopefully more, than what I impart as well. So I'm noting through here that a lot of people in K-12, we have some people in universities, and also for postgraduate students as well. Okay, excellent. And also we have in the public service. So a good mix of folk, and I'll be able to help tailor some of the content that I've got tonight so that it is more focused towards the areas that you are interested in. So by means of starting off, one of the things that I do like to do at the beginning of all of my sessions is an acknowledgement of country, and an acknowledgement of the country upon which I stand. Now, I believe that this is really important for education, and especially for those involved in open education, because the whole point of open education is being able to build upon, to work together, and to recognize the foundation that you're using in order to move forward in a spirit of collaboration. And so as an open practitioner, I think it's incredibly important to do these. And so what I would like to do is to recognize that I stand upon the ground of the Jarowa and Gayabal people of the Toowoomba region, but I also work on the lands of the Jagera, Yugara and Yugarapul people of Springfield and Ipswich, and also the Camberwell people of the Stanthorpe region. So I'd also like to acknowledge that they have been the custodians of this land for generations and have performed ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. And I would like to also give my thanks for their support of our academic enterprise, and to pay my respects to all of the elders past, present and emerging. So a brief introduction for me. As I said, I'm CSU alumni, so I'm familiar with the environment. One of the things that I do point out jokingly is that when I did my my bachelor through Charles Sturt, it's actually issued by the Faculty of Science and Agriculture which made perfect sense for librarianship because we're in the same school as viticulture, and wine and libraries naturally go together. Since then, I believe they have changed the structure significantly. Now, from there, I would describe myself as a librarian, a learning technologist, an online learning designer, an open culture advocate. One of my hobbies is I collect obscure words, and I will defend Oxford commas. So an eclectic and weird range of things. In terms of open education, I'm the co-convener of an Ascolite-sponsored group, which is the National Open Educational Practice Special Interest Group. And if you're interested in joining or coming along to meetings, those sorts of things, we meet once a month, and I can certainly share those details. I'm also active in the Creative Commons Australian chapter. And my main areas of research are around open education and really the role of the university. And given that we're talking about networks, knowledge networks and learning, I think that the main one that I would use is Twitter, simply because, well, it was an experiment that backfired on me. I first of all thought, after being told that social media was somewhere I needed to be, I rebelled against that idea, signed up simply to get the evidence to support the reasons as to why I should not be there, and then found it remarkably useful. And so that backfired on me, and I'm now very merrily gathering a lot of information via Twitter. So for tonight, a bit of a discussion, and we're going to cover a few different areas. So I really want to have the central theme of access and sharing as manifestations of power and control. And I think that when we start to accept or to identify areas of power and control when it comes to knowledge, we also start to have some very deep conversations about the implications of that for knowledge networks and also for networked societies. We're going to take a quick look at the phenomenon of enclosure, which I think plays a very large portion of influence over education, and then take a look then at the open, abundant and non-rivalrous nature of open education and open networks. So as we go through, I did mention beforehand that there will be opportunities where we'll stop, I'll pose some questions, and when I do so, feel free to just unmute your microphone and speak up, because I think that will add to a much more lively conversation than me rereading your texts out. The other thing as well, I think, is that if you are speaking with your own voice, then we're privileging your power to share, rather than having to go through a gatekeeper. So we're going to practice a little bit of what we preach here tonight. Now, one of the things that I always cleave to is really the UNESCO policies and statements around education. And when we're talking about access to knowledge, access to information, and the ability to gain the skills to network with people, we are really talking about a linchpin of education. And so UNESCO very wisely has taken the position that it's not just about acquiring knowledge, but it is also about developing positive attitudes and dispositional skills around knowledge in order to be successful. And that's one of the things which I think is going to come out, where the types of things that I'm talking about tonight around the critical thinking, identifying our environments, they are skills which we can foster, and they don't necessarily require a lot of content. They require the correct disposition and also the right environment to foster that. Now, a lot of what we do, and this is where the basis of the notion of power and access comes in, is that sometimes we will hearken back to access to knowledge as being a very good thing and kind of gloss over the reasons why it was actually done in the first place. So most of the libraries that we would recognise today came from the United Kingdom's Public Libraries Act of 1850. Now, it seems like a very good idea that any community with 10,000 people or more may, at the discretion of their council, be taxed half a shilling per year in order to create a public library, a place where people can go access knowledge for free, to spend their time there, to meet people of like minds, to engage in public lectures and public debate. All of this sounds really good. But it's well worth remembering that the main reason why the Public Libraries Act actually came into place was because the working class at the time had won some moderate victories around how their working hours would work, and found that they had a decent amount of leisure time. So the working class now had time on their hands. The middle class were deeply concerned about what the working class would do with free time. And in fact, most of them at that point considered that the main thing that they would do is go to public drinking houses, and there would be an increase in drunkenness. And so the idea of giving the working class something productive to do was actually the reason behind the Public Libraries Act. Now, that's horrific when we think about it today. The idea that in a very patronizing, very patriarchal sort of way, that you would set up free access to information as a way to deter perceived public drunkenness. But it's well worth looking at then the power dynamic here. You have people who are saying that they are doing a common good, but one can really question the reasons behind, or the motivation behind, what they were doing. As well as that, we then had, about 10 years later, a train line being put in that went straight from London to Oxford. And that allowed people, for the price of a train ticket, to have an outing to Oxford on any given day, and they would be able to have free access into the lectures that were occurring there. Now, several of the Oxford dons were deeply distraught with the idea that the only barrier to higher education was whether or not one could afford a train ticket to Oxford. And you can see here the quote that came from the rector of Lincoln College at the time. He was horrified at the thought that these people, the uneducated masses, were permitted onto a university ground in order to learn. Now, nowadays, of course, the idea of having an open campus and having public lectures and the like is something that we do as a matter of course. But it's well worth noting that when it first came in, it was something that was the subject of many a stern letter to the editor of the Times to try and raise awareness that there should be a stop put to these sorts of things. Now, if we fast forward a little bit, I'll give you my third scenario around power and access. And this one comes from the University of Sionowitz in Austria. Now, you might be familiar with the name Joseph Schumpeter. Now, he was a leading light in economic thought, particularly to do with entrepreneurialism and early capitalism. Now, he was teaching at the University of Sionowitz in 1909, and he assigned his students an assignment in which they would need access to the advanced economic thought held in a restricted part of the library that was off limits to undergraduates. Now, knowing this, he set the assignment anyway, and promptly said to his students that it didn't matter that they were undergraduates, but rather they were more than capable of understanding these advanced techniques, not through any great wisdom of their own, but simply because he was their teacher. And as such, his students were a cut above the rest. Now, the students went into the library, requested access, and were denied due to the policy. Now, Schumpeter responded to this library policy as any sane academic would. He, of course, challenged the librarian to a duel in the quad. There should be more of that, I think. I've spoken to some of my colleagues who think that perhaps academic promotion should look something like this. But the very next day, Schumpeter and the librarian fought a duel with swords, during which the librarian was given a scar that would remain upon his body until his dying day. The two of them became very best of friends, and Schumpeter's students were given access to the advanced economics collection as a matter of course. So you see here as well, this is about fighting for access. This is about trying to make sure that we are really being advocates of people getting access, But again, if we look at the motivation that Schumpeter had, he was simply saying that it was because of his superior teaching skills that his students would be able to engage with the collection, not necessarily that the students themselves were superior students. So from here, the question becomes, and I'd like you to have a bit of a think about both of these, and I'd like to hear your responses on either one of them. But when we start to talk about equity groups, and I am a very strong believer, especially in Australian higher education, that we do have groups of students that experience significant barriers to higher education, and those barriers really shouldn't be there. Okay, if you think back to that picture that I have on the very first slide of the freestanding gate, it has no fence. It's just simply a gate, but it does insist that the gate be closed. Now, one doesn't really understand why the gate needs to be closed. There's certainly no fence. And I think that in a lot of times in higher education, we are kind of that freestanding gate insisting that it be closed, but there's really nothing stopping people from bypassing it. But when we focus very strongly on the students who don't fit our systems, and I suppose that the same would happen in K-12, there is an implicit assumption that the system is operating perfectly. And it is instead the human beings that are at fault because they don't fit in with the system. And so I'd like to hear your thoughts on that idea of kind of reframing educational systems, of reframing access to say, well, is the problem with the system and not with the people? And the other thing then is what are the implications then of changing that focus? And what would we have to do if we wanted to actually embrace a notion that systems needed to change instead of people? So did anyone want to weigh in to start off with? Feel free to unmute and jump in.
Adrian, I'm interested, and I don't know whether we consider this systems or people. Okay. Because when I did my, sorry, it's Lisa Nash here. Oh. When I did my digital scholarship essay in our cohort, I was really looking at participatory cultures, and in particular, some of the examples that I was looking at was how Wikipedia, I mean, is sort of seen as that ultimate of open and commons and all that sort of thing. There'd been a lot of research done about the fact that actually women aren't very representative in inputting into Wikipedia for a variety of reasons. So, to me that sort of fits in with what you're talking about, is that, about different groups having access to information, but also those people even creating knowledge, then we've got certain groups aren't really representative in that.
It's an excellent point, and I think that when you raise the notion that people may be excluded, if you will, from the creation process by gender, it's also interesting to note that with Wikipedia, when it espouses to be the encyclopedia that anyone can edit, the number of edits that actually make their way through and stick, when you look at them in comparison to the general numbers, it's actually a very small percentage of users who have kind of risen to this almost elite status in Wikipedia, who are able to affect the greatest amount of change. And we're talking single-digit percentages, whereas the vast majority of users can go in and change things, but the chances of their changes staying are actually quite slim.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Adrian, because I mean, even for myself, I did a whole lot of work many years ago providing some sort of, edits and information to Wikipedia, and navigating that was very difficult, even for, myself, who felt that I had a reasonable handle on it. So, you're right. It's probably, and then all my edits got basically over the years have been taken away.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
And it's an experience worth sharing as well, because it does raise a lot of ideas around, if we're trying to democratize knowledge and democratize the knowledge creation process, then how does that actually play out on the ground? And I think that you sharing that part of your experience, it's a perfect counterpoint to this notion that everyone can get in and edit.
Mm.
Now, I know
yeah, so I'm finding this topic very fascinating, so I'm be grateful to hear what other people say too.
I'll just raise Lisa's point. She says that she's thinking very deeply about how this relates to a unit of study that she's designing to privilege Aboriginal knowledge and the Aboriginal patient experience. Part of the process, though, is tying up access to this shared information very tightly. And I think that when we deal with Indigenous Australian knowledge, and also how we privilege that knowledge, it raises a lot of really interesting discussions. One of my colleagues who works for Charles Darwin University, Joanna Funk, she works with a lot of very remote Indigenous communities around filming and around building resources, especially in the aquaculture area. Because one of the things that we need to realise is that the Indigenous communities of far north Queensland and the Northern Territory have been sustainably fishing for tens of thousands of years and doing a rather good job of it, a far better job than the white people who have been here for a little over 200 years. And one of the really shocking things that she found out was that due to state legislation, these communities who wanted to operate their own aquaculture businesses actually needed a Certificate 3 in aquaculture from TAFE in order to do this. And she said, well, that's rather ridiculous. In fact, we've got a large group of people here who could realistically be teaching the course. And what they found was that when she worked with the community, and they describe their practices, they produce the knowledge. And a lot of the times when I say to Joanna, whereabouts are you are you in any of these videos? And she says, no. She said, you see the microphone hanging over the boom? I got the job of having to hold the microphone. Or you see that person over there covered in mud who's having to, fish something out of a mangrove? Well, that's me. She has no speaking parts whatsoever in all of these. Everything is built from the knowledge of these communities. And the interesting thing that's happened now is a lot of those resources are making their way into the Certificate 3 of aquaculture and being used as learning and teaching resources. So I find that very interesting that you start off by telling a group of people who know the subject quite well, no, you're going to have to come into our knowledge systems. But once the material is actually ready and you start to examine the types of techniques and processes, those actually get folded in and brought into that knowledge system. So I think it's a very interesting place, Lisa. Did anyone else want to share any of their own thoughts around this before we move on to the next section? All right, and we've got some material in here. Sorry, we've got someone here, DP. Sorry, if I can have your first name at least, or Danielle. Okay, thank you. She said a school effectiveness product that is built on empowering the schools who will use it to be able to teach themselves, get smarter as a result. Ah, yes, the pushback from consultants. Yes. And I think you raise a really good point there, Danielle, around whether or not if experts, and I mean universities can be just as guilty as doing this as private consultants, is whether or not you're coming in and actually looking at context, looking at people's knowledge that already exists, and how you position yourself in that process. So I'd be very interested to see how that one pans out, Danielle. Okay, so we might move on from here. I've got a couple of other stop points through here where we'll be able to have a bit more of a chat as we go through. So When we look then at formal education, and this is from the Dawkins reforms of 1988 in Australia, and it's probably one of the most confused policy statements on education that you're likely to read, simply because it starts off with this great statement about what the university and what education is meant to do, and that it is the primary source of the skills we need in our lives. It acts to gather and preserve knowledge. It promotes greater understanding of culture, and I love this bit, often at odds with majority attitudes. And in doing so, supports the development of a more just and tolerant society. Now, if you worked for an organisation that said that this was their reason for existing, you could certainly hold your head in pride. But at the same time, in the same document, might I add, he moves then from this idea of public good to essentially abolishing state funding or federal funding for education, and shifts the cost to students, thus establishing HECS. So in very many ways, what this document does is it says, what we actually want is all of these things here, that we want you to think about topics that are going to create a more just and tolerant society. We don't mind if you are at odds with majority attitudes, because that is what a university is for. But in order to do so, you are going to have to individually pay for the privilege of being a part of this. And you can now probably see why I mentioned that this is a very confused piece of policy, because those two things don't necessarily go together. And in fact, I would argue that since 1988, we've gotten to a point where we normalise education with debt. The idea is that if you want to go to university, you want to get a degree, then one, the main reason that you're going to get a degree is to get a better job. Not necessarily to engage in the intellectual life of Australia or of your university or of your community. But the idea is that you're going to get a better job, which is going to pay more money, hopefully. And then the other thing as well is that the other normalised part is that you're going to pay for the privilege. And for those Australians who don't have the money, then they can defer the money. So essentially, we're now normalising the idea of having a debt post-graduation. So you can see here that in terms of access, again, we've got this very good notion of why people should have access to higher education, but then it kind of fails on the other side by saying that only the people who can afford it, or only the people who are willing to take on debt, are going to be those who benefit from it. And this is where what I do is I would raise the notion then that and I'll introduce one other idea here, is that whether or not you actually think that the types of educational experiences that you have undergone in your study, when you first signed up for university, when you first enrolled, were you doing it because it was an investment, a personal investment in your own development? Was it about better employment? I'd be very interested to see why you attended university. So if you wanted to weigh in on that, unmute or post in the chat, why was it that you decided to access a university education?
Hi, it's Karen here. Can you hear me?
Yes,
yes.
Please.
I always wanted to be a teacher librarian, and so the prerequisite was you needed a degree. So, and I entered university in 1990, just after HECS was introduced.
Sorry, I'll unmute myself. Right, yes. And so you're doing it as a way of kind of realizing your personal aspirations as well as your professional?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Okay, I can see here that that people are saying about personal development, but also hopefully a better job, that it was about career advancement, career focused. Someone's put in their parental expectations. And I can certainly say that was one of the things that when I decided to take a few years off after high school in order to figure out what I wanted to do, that was one of the things that I had to contend with was parental pressure saying, well, if you don't go to university, You're never going to make anything of yourself. What are you going to do in the meantime? And being able to sustain full-time employment. And so I'm taking a look here for a more interesting job, but again, the masters. Yeah, and that's an interesting one, Lisa, is that an undergraduate being about career, and then a master's being about personal interests. Oh my goodness, yes, Julie. Ah, right, okay, and again, yes. So you went through when things were subsidised by the government.
Absolutely, and the only degree I've ever paid for is the about 15 years ago, I decided I wanted an American degree from George Washington University, and I paid for that one. But that's the only one I've ever paid for. So I'm very lucky, I know. But bring back the good old days, I say. Free education.
Yes, absolutely. And Angela's raised a really good point here. That whether or not parental expectations will begin to shift over the next few years, because I don't know if any of you are aware, but certainly the university degree over the last couple of years has come under a lot of fire, where newspapers will actually lead with headlines, things like an $80,000 degree. Is it worth it? What is the return on investment? I've actually seen posters from people who are protesting fees, which say $100,000. Would you prefer an MBA or the down payment on a house? Do you want to be a homeowner or do you want an MBA? And so you're getting a lot of this. And Karen's mentioned TAFE versus university. Are you able to expand on that?
Oh, that was probably just shortcut, but yeah, it was on the television last night. I can't remember where I saw it, on the ABC, I think, about apprentices being able to get into the workforce quicker, and their earning capacity was as good or even better than contemporary university graduates.
Yes. Yep. And there is that notion as well of how much are you going to earn. In fact, when you look at the bands into which university courses are placed, and you would all notice from your degrees which band your degree is placed, those bands govern how much HECS you pay. And the reason why those bands exist is that they actually say that it's dependent on the projected future earnings. So in other words, if you do a medical degree and you're intending on graduating as a surgeon, for example, you will pay more HECS than somebody who is doing an arts degree, because the idea is that the doctor will be earning more. And what I think that does very interestingly is that kind of perception starts to privilege knowledge as well. So in this, you're essentially saying that knowledge of surgery, knowledge of medicine is more valuable than knowledge of the arts, of philosophy, of ethics. And so when you look at those kinds of discourse, unpacking them and realizing that what they're doing is implicitly saying that some knowledge is more valuable than others and some disciplines are more valuable than others is well worth mentioning in the higher education context. And we've got a good bit of discussion here around the article. So I will have to open up that article and take a read of it once I'm finished here tonight. Thank you very much for sharing. And that was from Angela. Thank you. Okay, so as we move from there, one of the last concepts that I want to deal with on this level at least is this notion of the ideological state apparatus, which sounds deeply confronting. But the idea is that there are certain mechanisms within civil society, and we can point to our sporting clubs, university, school, libraries. I would also point to things like religion that are used by governments to essentially keep the status quo. So when we start to look at higher education and even primary school education, I would argue, we start to get to a point where education is perhaps for the purpose of reinforcing how society works at the moment. This idea that you go to university, accrue debt, become a skilled worker, get a higher paying salary, pay higher taxes, have this social mobility. These are the kinds of things that implicitly underpin the ideological state apparatus, rather than it necessarily being a university as being a place where, if we remember Dawkins' phrase, where you're allowed to stand in opposition to prevailing norms. So this is an idea, especially around access to knowledge and around the purpose of networks, where what you've got to do is also think about what is being propped up by the kind of network that you have. And there's been a lot of really good discussion recently, especially around Twitter, that people who are building their own professional learning networks are essentially building them out of people and contacts who agree with them. That very, very few times in a professional learning network will you actively recruit somebody into your network who is going to stand in opposition to your beliefs and is going to challenge you to justify them. And exactly what Julia said there, an echo chamber. And in fact, I think it was on ABC Radio a number of years ago, I heard the best piece of advice, which is where they said that if you are listening to the news, if you're reading the news or the equivalent, and you find yourself completely and totally agreeing with what you are hearing and what you're reading, it's probably time to find a different news outlet.
Adrian, it's Lisa
Yes.
Hampshire speaking. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
I've got a parallel analogy, I suppose, to offer in regard to those comments. And that is, I was just reading the other day, and I've experienced it myself, and perhaps others have too, that we live in an age of streaming media services. We choose our playlist on Spotify, we decide what we want to watch on Netflix, whatever it happens to be. And it's not good for us because it eliminates diversity, whether it's music, whether it's the programs that you're watching. You're not challenging yourself to watch something or listen to something or to buy into a different opinion that perhaps you otherwise wouldn't hear, because you're curating your own playlist. And the same is true of those news services and of professional learning networks, because as exactly what you're saying, we just choose a very homogenous group of professional learning because it's easy. Anyway, that's what I had to say.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think that when you start to shape these networks, there is a certain amount of that diversity that, and also I think the discovery of the new, and it raises a really good issue that I came across as an academic librarian, where there was a school of thought which was talking about the precision with which we can locate, say, articles, journal articles, and then have the related journal articles show up. They're all grouped together by discipline and by very specific keywords, and that the idea is that you're almost destroying serendipitous discovery, where if you go to the shelves and you're looking for a book, that you may find the book that you're after, but then what happens is that you may locate another book on an adjacent shelf that you weren't looking for. And I think the same happens. I mean, I would love it if I went into, say, for example, YouTube, and it says, we noticed that you've been listening to, well, as I do, you've been listening to an awful lot of Billy Joel. What have you ever considered listening to Metallica? Something completely different, for example. And me thinking to myself, well, maybe I'll give Metallica a go. Maybe they're okay. And I think that the algorithms, perhaps, yes, thank you, Lisa. You're obviously a Metallica fan, excellent. And so as a result, I think that the algorithms that start to shape these networks are missing out on what is really a fundamentally human experience. And I can see that I've got a few people here who have mentioned algorithms as well. Excellent. And so, yeah, when you start to look at it, think about whether or not the networks that you're participating in, the networks that you're constructing, the networks that you're drawing information from, are they actually privileging a dominant narrative, or are they actually including divergent and diverse voices? Because if they're not, then this notion of this ideological state apparatus comes into play. So when we consider them, we'll have a short stop here before we go on to openness. And then, so what I really would like to hear is whether or not you think that a university, a library, or as most of you are in K-12, whether or not you think that the schools, as a publicly funded institution for knowledge sharing and knowledge creation, are they actually places, you think, of free thoughts, often at odds with majority attitudes? Or do you think that we've actually constructed these things that they are now part of the ideological state apparatus? So I'd be very interested to see. I know that it's a bit of a deep question for this time of night, but I'd be very interested to see what you thought. One on chat. Yeah, Lisa, you do bring a really good point here, that there are a lot of commercial interests. And yes, and also, you know, it doesn't have to be an either or. I'm always a big fan of casting out either or and putting and instead, because I think that, yeah, I mean, that's just from me, but I mean, I work in higher education, whereas we've got a lot of people here from K-12. So I'd be interested to see whether or not you think that, you know, schools, are they there about critical thinking, about questioning the status quo, or are they primarily there to reinforce it? Okay, and so what I'm going to do at this point is we might revisit this one, have a bit of a think about it, because as we move on through the idea of the commons and the like, you might find that that sparks some ideas as well for your own contexts. So I'll move on to now going then instead to this notion of the commons. And this is what really underpins open education. This idea that there are, or at least there were, resources that were not considered ownerless. So things like forests, the sea, rivers, and the like, that were not ownerless, but rather commonly owned. And it's only actually a very recent notion that, that people can actually own items that were in the commonwealth. So, for example, one of the more contentious things that you could argue in Australia is that, is it perfectly okay, for example, for our coal mines to be owned by individuals or to be owned by corporations who then take the vast majority of that wealth and keep it in-house instead of sharing the proceeds, the monetary proceeds of these natural resources, these common resources, with everybody? I mean, it's one of those things that when you look at things from a natural resources perspective, it does raise a lot of issues around whether or not it is actually okay to own these things and whether or not it's okay to commercially benefit from them. So it has, of course, extended towards information resources, and we end up in this idea of academic capitalism. So you are probably familiar with this idea that for journal articles, for example, and I know that Julie will have encountered this as well, that in order for us to be considered as, you know, serious members of the university, we engage in research. We want to have that research published. And part of publishing the research is signing over your IP to a multinational publisher who then owns the output of your research, who commercializes it and charges people access to your research. And the way that we know that your research is actually of good quality is that peer reviewers, so your peers, volunteer their labor to review the article to bring it up to a standard where it can be essentially published and then on-sold. So the very idea that you could construct a business model that looked like that is astounding. And in fact, from an open perspective, a lot of people are actually saying, well, how is it that we allow a model like that takes research in particular, which is publicly funded, and then allows it to be signed over for free to a commercial entity who will then charge the same society a fee a second time, if you will, to access the proceeds of their taxpayer-funded research. So these are the sorts of questions that come up. It also comes up when you consider textbook markets. So we're now in an age where we have now reached the point where it is possible to pay pay upwards of $400 for any individual textbook. And Angela raises a good question: does the academic get any of the money? And no. We do not see any proceeds of the sale of the journal towards us. We don't even get a royalty or a commission or a percentage. It is simply an accepted part of academic culture that you publish. And the only time that you do receive any sort of payment is if you are in the process of publishing, for example, a textbook. And even then, the amount, the percentage that you would receive that attracts the royalties, it can actually be quite small. Yeah, and the percentage, as Julie said, the percentage is very low. Jokingly, a colleague of mine recently said to me that his royalty check had come in for a textbook that he'd written, and I said to him, "Well, how wealthy are you feeling?" And he said, "Well, I could take you down to the coffee shop and shout you a cuppa." So again, it's a huge amount of interest and industry on behalf of the academic staff to create something that is then commodified. And Angela asks, book publications becoming less and less? To a certain extent. A lot of the big companies like Pearson, for example, are specifically trying to take all of their business to be digital. And that sounds really novel, and it plays to this idea of who's privileged, who's not, with the digital access. And the idea that a digital textbook is going to be cheaper. They've actually said, Pearson has said it is going to be cheaper. But the problem is when you go fully digital and every student has an individual ID code, we then reach a point where books don't enter the secondhand market. There is now no longer a cheaper alternative to the publisher resource. And so when you go down that route, you also have to talk about whether or not people have got the internet connection required to maintain contact with an ebook, with all of the links, all the Web 2 contents, as Lisa's mentioned in her message above there. Those sorts of things are well worth considering, rather than simply saying that electronic access is a good thing. It's also predicated on an idea that it is about scarcity. And education in general has been in a privileged position where they can charge for access. They can do these things simply because access to knowledge, access to information, access to people has been scarce. But when you look at nowadays, if you want to learn how to do something, going to Wikipedia, going to eHow, for example. I needed to learn on the weekend. I was helping my son to build a small outdoor stove, and the first thing I did, went online, checked it out. And those little discrete bits of informal learning are, I think, where the really interesting future is going to be, because it's outside of these kinds of systems that we have set up. Okay, so when we then move then into this idea of open, abundant, and non-rivalrous information and resources and ways of working. So I mentioned beforehand about these, the notion of scarcity. So scarcity is an economic model designed to drive up prices, designed to drive up demand, because something is scarce. There's only a limited amount. However, if I want to share an idea, or if I want to share a document, or I want to share a resource, and I do it online, the cost is actually quite small. We still have issues around whether or not people can actually access that information, but notionally, it's now become quite easy to do. And in addition to that, I'm not the only one doing it. You can easily guess that 50 other people are doing the same thing. And so when we talk about open education, it's really about using mechanisms, legal mechanisms, usually Creative Commons licenses, which are embedded into the federal legal framework. And the Creative Commons license basically says, if I want to apply one to my own work, it says, I want to be noticed as or attributed as the author. This is my intellectual work. This is my intellectual output. But what I want to do is I want to share it. And under a Creative Commons license, it has what we call human readable code, which in 3 or 4 dot points, it actually says that on there that you can do the following. So you can reuse, you can remix, you can repurpose, you can edit it, as long as you do the following. And it will list a couple of very clear, very straightforward things that you're expected to do. So in this kind of an environment, you're actually able to use a legal mechanism to upfront tell people that you want to share, that you want to collaborate, that you want people to build upon your work, and that you'd really appreciate them sharing it back. And some of the best things that I've experienced in open education is where you find your work in the strangest of places. I created a video a few years back which explained Creative Commons licenses and how to use them. And around about 5 months later, I ended up with someone sending me an email, and they said to me, did you know that your video is currently being used by Creative Commons in Poland? So it was doing the rounds through Poland, and somebody had actually gone to the trouble of doing some subtitles to it in Polish. Because of course I don't speak Polish. I'm on a good day I can speak English. So it was really cool because I put a Creative Commons license on it. I said, go out, do what you want with this. Just make sure that you attribute that I'm the original author. And you spot your work showing up in the strangest of places. And sometimes people will email me back and say, hey, I watched your video on this. Did you consider including this part? Or I've got a case study that you might like to use. And you start to have these conversations about teaching and learning and about how to express ideas. And a lot of the time, as I put here, a focus on context, people will actually say to me, did you know though that in my country it works differently? I mean, it never crossed my mind when I'm talking about students working out in the open, okay, being able to contribute knowledge on the open web. And I was speaking to a colleague and he said to me, yes, but I actually have students who are in countries where they express those kinds of opinions online and out in the open. When they graduate and they return to their country of origin, they could be imprisoned or killed. So openness is not actually a freedom that everyone enjoys. And that's something that I think that we do not acknowledge often enough. So again, when we're talking about knowledge networks, some people simply don't have the freedom to participate. And that's another kind of privileged position that we need to consider when we're talking about things from an Australian perspective. The other thing that I think is that it really starts to look at shared ownership. And later on, what I've got here is questions about who is privileged enough, or who has the power to create, whose voices are actually heard. And these are some of the really big things that come up in open education, and they are the big questions that are worth tackling. So what I will do is just take a quick look at some of the assumptions here before we start to close down. And if we look and we try to look a bit broadly about these sorts of things, open education starts to ask a lot of questions. And if you remember right at the beginning when I said, do we need to look at whether or not the system is broken, or whether or not the people are at fault because they can't fit in the system, or whether or not it's a bit of both? These kinds of questions get us to really think about what we're doing in education, whether or not you're in K-12, vocational education, university, whether or not you're in a library. All of these kinds of things are questions that you need to ask yourself. Now, I have a public library background, and one of the things that we always used to note and take pride in a public library was, as I mentioned to folk, it's warm in winter, it's cool in summer, you can stay as long as you want, no one will hassle you to buy anything, and we actually don't mind if you sleep there during the day as well. And in fact, the very idea that people felt safe enough in a public library to fall asleep was always astounding. It amazed me that people would do that. But so open access and who gets to walk in through the front door is something that I kind of took for granted. You work in a public library, you're a civil servant, okay? The community comes in, okay? You get to know them, you share stories, those sorts of things. But when you consider then in a formal setting, what are the actual roles of the teacher and the student? Which one of you is permitted to create knowledge? Or have you actually set up an environment where both of you are permitted to create knowledge? Are debt and education meant to be normalized? We've talked about that. Who actually owns the intellectual output? One of the things that I have to grapple with is that in a university, as a staff member, as someone who has signed an employment contract, when I create work from my employment, my employer owns my intellectual output, except for research. Research belongs to me. And then if I go with traditional publishing, I'm foolish enough to sign that off to a corporation. But this idea that the very intellectual work that we do can be owned by somebody. And also, I think that the behaviours that we exhibit when we are engaging out in the open, when we are using open access material, these behaviours that we are engaging with essentially are going to influence students who I always say you should look at as your future colleagues. So when I look at the audience here today, there's a possibility that you could be future faculty at a university. I could end up working shoulder to shoulder with you. And so when I talk about these kinds of things, the way things are, absolutely, and Danielle's mentioned that, okay, when I get you to question the way things are there different ways of doing things? Are there ways to actually make this a truly democratic process? Then I'm also helping to shape belief and shape behaviour for colleagues who are going to work alongside me later on. Now, what I will do, now Karen's mentioned here that if you create a video at work and then assign Creative Commons, are you in the wrong? Well, the answer to that is it depends on your employer, because your employer will actually have somewhere who owns the work that you create. And the fundamental part of a Creative Commons license is a Creative Commons license can only be applied by the copyright holder. So it depends on whether or not you own your work. So and Angela's mentioned that in her setting, the employer owns it. And it is a very, yeah, exactly right, Karen, it is a tricky situation. So when you get a chance to review this and take a look through, I'll make sure that my slides are shared. I've provided here a list of resources and places that you can go if you would actually like to explore this in more detail. And you also have some links through to my Twitter profile as well, and also, you know, the network that I have, you know, joining in on the conversation. So if you do at any point start to use these things or have questions, I really don't mind if you want to engage on Twitter. Okay, then, and just send me a message, whether it be openly or direct message or the like, and I would really like to hear how you want to use these kinds of resources as well. And they are everything from learning plans, videos, assessment plans, entire textbooks. And Karen said that she's used many of these, and yeah, I'm glad to hear that you found some great stuff in there. And so really, when we come to the end of tonight, and this is where we are right now, is that the question is whether or not, when information resources like this become abundant, should we continue to value the content? Or, and, okay, either or, but we'll change that to an and is there a space for what is known as Web 1? So we talk about Web 2, we talk about Web 3. Okay, Web 1 is put forward by anthropologists as being those basic human connections. Okay, so for example, if I have a question that I know Julie has knowledge on, then I'm actually contacting Julie directly and I'm saying, hey, can you help me out with this? That's a Web 1 relationship. Okay, it's human to human. And I think, well, it's my point, and I'd be very interested to hear where you stand on this, is that I think that when content is so abundant and content has moved beyond a model of scarcity, and we want to share open resources and we want to invite people to collaborate with us, I think we're at a point now where the content takes the back burner and instead we privilege this space for Web 1. So where the humans actually step up and humanity itself becomes the most important part of education, not the content. So I'm going to leave it there with that idea that perhaps the greatest asset that we have in open education are the human beings and our humanity. And I'm very happy to open up the floor for discussion or questions.
Well, Adrian, I'm going to jump in here because I want to, well, I'm going to thank you in a minute, but, but we're still talking for the minute. The humanisation of nature, look, from my perspective is, and I say this to my students all the time, you must put your ideas and your thoughts out there, which is why in this degree, we encourage the use of Twitter, we encourage the use of networking, we encourage the use of blogging. There are blogging requirements, assessment requirements to maintain a blog. And I get a little frustrated sometimes with students who don't want anyone else to see their blog except me, because I think it's a privilege, but it's almost like an expectation. It is an expectation from my point of view that you will be open with your information, that it's something that you can put out there, but people are still very nervous about it. So this whole thing about creation, you're talking about who creates what and where do you put it, and then therefore who owns it. I know we sort of go round and round in circles, but I still think as a learner, you need to have that confidence in your own creation of information and the confidence that you can put it out there and people will respect it.
I think in that situation, and basically I'll say this, and then I'd actually be interested to hear from any of the students around their notions of perhaps a reticence to share if they've embraced this sharing, is I think that part of what we need to do as educators very much is to maintain a safe learning space. And that's where, when I talk about open assessment and students actually creating content out in the open, part of the really tricky balancing act is to what extent you need to engender the trust with students that it is a safe space and that things are that there's enough in place that they're looked after, versus the fact that essentially the type of skills that you're talking about, Julie, the ability to share openly, to put even half-formed ideas out there, it's a type of courage that you actually need in order to operate out there in the world. And so I think that finding the balance there is actually really quite tricky. And Karen said, that's a brilliant commendation. Karen said that she felt very safe with her 2017 cohort. And Heather said that embracing sharing, best part of the course. So did anyone else have any thoughts around, you know, the sharing, whether or not you perhaps felt a bit reticent at the beginning of the semester and maybe you felt a bit better about it at the end, or anything like that? Any experiences around?
I think Julie hit the nail on the head. It's a confidence thing. And coming from a profession like mine, librarians have always been good at sharing, I believe, and haven't really kept things to themselves. So I think that made it easier for me, and the support that we got from not just the people that were in charge of our subject, but also other people within our course led to us being as I said, the 2017 Heather was in that as well. Danielle was in there as well, and you can see we've come back. So we feel that we can share.
Yeah, it's Lisa here, Adrian. I think for some people there is a they maybe do need to learn how to use some of these digital networks, and by I suppose being exposed to that a long time ago, and really like Judy O'Connell got me involved on Twitter many years ago. Then that built up my confidence before I came into the course, because I was involved in a lot of digital media, as a lot of people here were saying, like Karen. But I did notice it in the course that, I think some people didn't have that sort of practice. And then also I think you have to be fairly confident then, because the way people sometimes responded to you, I could see some people turned them off because they would stop responding because people were a bit combative, and I don't know if they meant it that way, but I think there's definitely some skills that people need to learn also about, respecting other people's thoughts. And so I think for people who aren't confident, then it just needs one person to sort of say something in the wrong way, and writing isn't the best. That's why something like this is great, Julie, because when you see someone face to face and you're talking, it's a bit different than when we write on a forum post and someone sort of feels like they're being attacked, perhaps. And that mightn't be the way it came across. So I think, so again, that's a very interesting thing that came out of my essay too. I think that's also how a lot of women felt with Wikipedia.
Yes. And again, I think that it comes down to not only the safety of the space, but also to a certain extent, perhaps, for lack of a better word, a type of digital resilience. That you might get knocked back a little bit. And let's face it, the nature of public discourse online is such that I think one of the best books that's been written recently about it around online public discourse is a book which is called I'm Right and You're an Idiot. And I think that sums it up perfectly fine, how a lot of this discourse works. And Karen, I was really interested as well to hear about yes, librarians are very good at sharing. I mean, we see it as a professional attribute to be able to share. But interestingly, there's been a few larger scale studies around librarians and open content. And unlike most other professions to do with, whether it be teachers, whether it be academic staff, the like, they've actually found that the number one reason why librarians don't feel confident in sharing is that they're not sure if what they're producing is actually high quality enough. They're actually really harsh on their own work, and quite accepting and sharing of other people's work, but they are their own harshest critics. And I'm just wondering if that's something that have you encountered in terms of sharing your own work?
Yeah, probably too many type A's in libraries. I've since shared my case study that I did for this subject in 2017 to the School Library Association of Victoria. And for the moment, it is locked behind membership access only. But when the next issue comes out, that'll become open access. So that was something I sort of kept in mind. I didn't really want to give it just to anyone that it'd be locked down forever. So yeah, but you do have that doubt about whether what you've written is good enough. Definitely.
And I would say that it's certainly not limited to librarians, but it was just very interesting when you do a review of the literature and around the barriers to people sharing. It was just strange that the number one that came out for librarians was that, whereas in other professions, it would come out much lower on the list.
And I think that what Karen was saying, it's writing for a publication like SLAV or other academic or professional journals where it's behind a paywall or locked down, and some are, some aren't. I mean, to some extent, it gives it validity. Oh, someone has valued my work such that they're making it available to the members, because the members will also really value it. And no, we don't really want it out there where people will read it and not value it. So we have these sort of inhibitions, don't we, about the value of our work and the format of our work. It's like publishing a book. Well, someone's going to put money into publishing a book. I will get a little bit of royalties, but this is a really, valued thing to do, publishing a book. Whereas, in fact, a lot of the stuff that's in the book is already on a blog somewhere that's already been open access for 10 years. The fact that it's been collated into a book now gives it more value and prestige. So it's all quite screwed up, really, isn't it, in many ways?
Well, I think as well what you point to there is the commercialization aspect, where one of the really big barriers that you hit with open education and this whole notion of sharing the resources is that surely if it's free, you're getting what you pay for. That if I ask my students to purchase a $130 text from a known publisher, this is going to be high quality. If I adopt a text that is written by academic colleagues, has been peer reviewed, but is free, then maybe there's something wrong with it. Maybe it was rejected by a publisher. And so that whole idea, this commodification and commercialization framing that we put around knowledge, it's so insidious and it is so ever present that it now comes to the point where people say, well, what actually makes information valuable? And I think you raised, I think that speaks very clearly to what you were saying, Julie. And Danielle's written there, yeah, so it's the research or the membership that's valuable. And so I suppose that perhaps paying a membership and getting things that other people don't have access to comes straight back to that model of scarcity. You're building up a value. You're saying that membership to this organization is valuable because we will give you things that other people can't get. But that's just one perspective on it.
Right. Well, what else? I think we just about need to finish this evening. Fiona says, I think sharing and publishing are learned dispositions. Yep.
Absolutely.
Yes, yeah. And that's true. And that's why a degree like this, we are trying to learn this disposition towards openness, to at least understand the implications of it. But Adrian, look, thanks so much. Some of the background to being open, becoming open, the implications of publication. There's certainly a lot to think about. It's not something that can fit into one academic paper, really. Which is what the students actually in this class have been charged with, writing in one academic paper and then doing one research project. So it's a lot to fit in when we have such wonderful inspiration from our Colloquium guests. So, Adrian, thanks once again for your input. Do you have a link to your, under your fingertips, to your Ascolite blog that you could throw in the window there?
Yes, I certainly can.
Or I can share it with them anyway, with students. So you mentioned earlier, if you want to join or to come along to some of your monthly sessions, there it is.
Yep, so the
yeah. Great. Right, that's excellent. So Adrian has special guests, and there's a whole lot of there's quite a lot going on in Australia, and of course beyond Australia. And Adrian has quite good links beyond Australia as well, with the open movement, open educational practice, etc. So look, stay in touch. Adrian is now part of your PLN. Okay, so you can tweet him, as he said, tweet him anytime if you need anything or want to say anything or etc. And this recording will be shared more widely with the class as well. So thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Julie. I feel really honoured to be invited to come along to speak, and I'm really glad that I've met all of you. So as Julie said, please, let's make each other parts of our personal learning networks. And whilst we have covered a lot of ground tonight, hopefully there's an aspect of what we've talked about that you might be able to grab a hold of and really open it up as the basis for one of your papers. So best of luck with the course, and I'm really looking forward to continuing the conversation with you.
Thank you. And a shout out to our alumni who found the time to join us once again as well. It's great to see you all. Thanks, everyone. Good night.